Hey, welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History at jbshreve.com, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world around us with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made these times. Today, we are continuing our story, our series, The Empire, a 250-year American story, and we're looking at the Civil War. Now, in this episode today, I want to specifically start pulling back the curtain on the divisions of the Civil War, the different generals who became really quite renowned for their exploits, their leadership, and their legends during this terrible fight. All right, so that's where we're going to be going in this episode today. As always, I have included a host of supporting posts and articles on the website, theendofhistory.net. If you want to go deeper into these topics and these stories, that's a great place to start. Let's go ahead and jump into the generals of the Civil War, episode 26 here at the End of History and the Empire, a 250-year American story.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So in our last episode, we saw how the firing on Fort Sumter, that's what started the Civil War. That was the breakout point, really, the first shots fired. But the first major battle of the American Civil War took place July 21st, 1861, near Manassas Junction, Virginia, and what Northerners called the First Battle of Bull Run, and Southerners called the First Battle of Manassas. And it's called that because there would be a second Battle of Bull Run, a second Battle of Manassas. So although the nation had already been shocked by the firing on Fort Sumter, many Americans on both sides, they still believed the conflict would be short. This was going to be decisive, perhaps even glorious, was the way they were seeing it. Bull Run kind of began to challenge those assumptions. The author Richard Slotkin, he explains the Civil War was a people's war, a war Americans chose to fight and willingly maintain despite the cost in blood, suffering, and treasure. This was true on both sides, who quickly learned to demonize and degrade the other. In the North, public pressure mounted on President Lincoln to strike quickly against the Confederacy. Newspapers, politicians, citizens, they demanded action. They were convinced that one strong blow would crush the rebellion, and that would restore the Union. So many Union soldiers were inexperienced volunteers who had enlisted for only 90 days, and they expected the war would probably be over before their terms had even expired. The South harbored its own illusions. Many Confederates believed that their superior military, their superior leadership, fighting on home soil, the greater determination that they had, that it would quickly secure their independence. And there was this widespread confidence that Northerners lacked the will to endure a prolonged conflict. The historian Alan Taylor, he writes, defining themselves as honorable and brave, Southern leaders cast Yankees as cowardly money grubbers who would never fight. Well, they were wrong, right? The atmosphere surrounding this first major battle, this one at Bull Run, it reflected those unrealistic expectations. Washington socialites, politicians, curious civilians, they literally rode out with picnic baskets to watch this battle unfold. They wanted to watch the fighting. They were treating the engagement, this military engagement, as a public spectacle or a sporting event. Few imagined they were witnessing the opening chapter of a war that would kill more Americans than any conflict in the nation's history. Now, early in the battle, Union forces appeared to be winning. Confederate lines started to buckle until reinforcements arrived, and one Confederate brigade, led by General Thomas Jackson, held firm under this intense pressure. Now, according to a legend, a fellow officer described that Jackson stood like a stone wall, and that gave him the famous nickname we all know him by as Stonewall Jackson. Now, I'll talk more about Stonewall Jackson in a bit, but as Union forces retreated, the withdrawal turned into a chaotic rout back toward Washington, D.C. The Confederate victory here, it electrified the South and seemed to confirm Southern hopes that independence might be won quickly. And yet the battle's scale and ferocity also revealed a sobering truth. Neither side had really achieved a decisive result, and both armies had shown surprising resilience. So many Southerners argued after the fact that the rebel Confederates should have pressed into Washington following the fight. It was just a matter of 30 miles. And it's kind of an amazing what-if of history. The Union Army had been defeated on the battlefield, as we'll see. It was pretty much horribly disorganized at the outset of the war. So the South might have been able to do just that. They might have been able to accomplish this at that point in the fighting. Now imagine this what if. Imagine if the rest of the Civil War had never happened, but on that day the Confederate Army had marched into Washington, D.C., triggering a panic and ordering Lincoln and the Union to surrender on the terms of the Confederates. It's a pretty impressive image, pretty impressive what if, but also probably not realistic in the end. Because although the Southern Army won the battle that day, they weren't really all that much better organized or prepared for all-out war than the Union Army was. If anything, they were probably less prepared for all-out war. What Bull Run actually proved to people on both sides was that they were each willing to bleed for their side, for their cause. This wasn't going to be an easy affair, not like they had first imagined it to be. So although even at that point, they didn't realize how much worse it was going to get, they did both sides started to see inklings of this may not go the way we thought it would go. The Confederate States of America, they emerged from a Southern society profoundly shaped by hierarchy, by wealth, and an aristocratic vision of leadership. So while Southerners often celebrated ideals of independence and local self-government, political and social power in the antebellum South was concentrated in the hands of a relatively small planter elite. Large landowners, many of whom derived their wealth from enslaved labor, they dominated the state legislatures. They influenced national politics, and they set the cultural tone of Southern society. This ruling class cultivated an image of refinement, of honor, of personal courage and duty that bore similarities to aristocracies of Europe. This is what we see in the movies when we think of the Confederacy. When we think of the South during this time, it's usually this aristocracy, this elite. This is one of the reasons why the South believed Europe would be such an easy ally for them during the war. Just like France had come to the aid of America during the Revolutionary War, the South expected the powers of Europe to come to the aid of the Confederate States of America in this Civil War. This expectation was driven partly by financial interests. Cotton was still king, but it was also driven by cultural similarities in the aristocracies of the South with that of Europe. The Belgian king, Leopold, he celebrated the monarchical aristocratic principles in the southern states. That's a quote from him. The monarchical aristocratic principles in the southern states. And other European nations and governments, they believed they were witnessing the end of the American Republic. Like this was inevitable. They knew this was coming. They knew this was going to happen. And it would be a good thing, in their minds anyways, it would be a good thing as it would discourage and demoralize the Republican revolutions that had already been excited, that had already been triggered by America. A British parliamentarian during this time, he declared, "We are now witnessing the bursting of the great Republican bubble, which had so often been held up to us as a model on which to recast our own English Constitution." Another guy, a French cabinet minister, he put it plainly to an American. He said, "Your republic is dead, and it's probably the last the world will see." So central to the South's aristocratic culture was this concept of honor. A Southern gentleman was expected to demonstrate courage, defend his reputation, protect his family, fulfill obligations to his local community. Public esteem mattered deeply. Personal character was measured not only by integrity, but by one's willingness to stand firm under pressure. When secession came, many Southern leaders viewed the crisis through this very lens of honor and loyalty. They believed they were defending their homes. They were defending their states, their way of life, against what they perceived as outside coercion. So this culture found its most visible expression in the Confederate officer corps that developed as the Civil War broke out. Many, if not most, of the South's Confederate generals, they became symbols of gallantry and martial virtue. They often projected an image that seemed drawn from an earlier age, mounted officers leading from the front, displaying this personal bravery under fire and inspiring devotion among the troops. So you had figures like Stonewall Jackson. You had J.E.B., often pronounced as J.E.B. Stuart. Stuart became the embodiment of the Southern cavalryman known for a plumed hat, flowing cape, infectious confidence, he would lead these daring reconnaissance missions in spectacular rides around Union armies that elevated him into legendary status throughout the war. His intelligence gathering helped fuel many of Robert E. Lee's and the South's greatest victories, while his bold raids embarrassed Union commanders and thrilled Southern newspapers. To admirers, J.E.B. Stuart represented courage, chivalry, audacity. His battlefield exploits transformed him from a cavalry officer into one of the Confederacy's most celebrated heroes. James Longstreet, he earned a reputation as one of the Confederacy's most capable and dependable commanders. Less flamboyant than J.E.B. Stuart, less celebrated than Robert E. Lee, Longstreet was widely respected for his steadiness, his tactical skill, his battlefield judgment. He was nicknamed Lee's Old War Horse. He played a decisive role in many of the Army of Northern Virginia's greatest victories, including Fredericksburg and Chickamauga. Longstreet excelled at defensive warfare and often advocated practical military solutions over romantic notions of combat. His calm demeanor under fire, his willingness to challenge conventional thinking, really made him one of the Civil War's most effective generals and one of Robert E. Lee's most trusted subordinates. Then there's Joseph E. Johnston. He was a veteran of the Mexican-American War, one of the highest-ranking officers to lead the United States Army when his home state seceded. Johnston possessed a reputation for professionalism, for discipline, for strategic caution. Unlike some Confederate commanders who sought dramatic battlefield victories, Johnston focused on preserving his army and avoiding unnecessary losses. His skillful withdrawals during campaigns in Virginia and Georgia, they frustrated Union commanders and prolonged Confederate resistance. Though often overshadowed by Robert E. Lee and frequently at odds with Confederate President Jefferson Davis, Johnston was admired by his soldiers for his concern for their welfare. He was remembered as one of the South's most capable generals. The future general, Ulysses S. Grant, he saw Johnston and not Robert E. Lee as the most formidable of the South's generals in his memoirs and his autobiography that he wrote later in life. Then there was Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest emerged as one of the most feared and unconventional commanders of the Civil War. He had very little formal military training, unlike some of his peers at the time, but he relied on instinct, on this audacity, and an extraordinary understanding of mobility and surprise. A cavalry commander of remarkable aggression, he repeatedly defeated larger Union forces through rapid movement and decisive action. His famous maxim, often summarized as getting there first with the most men. All right, this reflected his emphasis on speed and initiative. To admirers, Nathan Bedford Forrest embodied the rugged, hard-fighting spirit of the Confederacy and earned him a reputation as a military genius in cavalry warfare. Now, among all the Confederate generals of the Civil War, few achieved the legendary status of Stonewall Jackson. A stern, deeply religious Virginian, we've already seen how he earned his nickname at the Battle of Bull Run. Jackson's reputation, it really grew rapidly as he demonstrated an extraordinary ability to move troops with speed and with secrecy. His 1862 Shenandoah Valley campaign, it became one of the most celebrated operations really in military history. With a relatively small force, Stonewall Jackson repeatedly outmaneuvered larger Union armies. He kept them off balance. He prevented them from reinforcing campaigns elsewhere. His soldiers just utterly admired him for his fearlessness, his relentless energy, his unwavering faith, even as they endured these grueling marches at his command that earned him the nickname Jackson's Foot Cavalry. Stonewall Jackson's military brilliance was matched by a collection of unusual personal habits that fascinated both friends and soldiers, all right? He was a deeply devout Presbyterian. He prayed frequently. He believed firmly in divine providence. Jackson was convinced that one side of his body was heavier than the other, so he would occasionally raise one arm high in the air to improve circulation, restore his physical balance. He often sucked lemons whole, believing that they aided his health. He adhered to strict dietary practices. Quietly and intensely, he was a very private guy. He rarely revealed his plans, even to close subordinates. And these eccentricities just kind of added to the mystique that surrounded his legendary reputation. No one held Jackson in higher esteem than Robert E. Lee. Together, Robert E. Lee and Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, they formed one of the most formidable command partnerships of the war. Lee trusted Jackson with some of the Army's most critical and dangerous assignments, confident that Jackson would execute them with boldness and precision. Following Jackson's accidental wounding by friendly fire at the Battle of Chancellorsville and his surprising death 8 days later in May 1863, Robert E. Lee, he really felt that loss deeply. Upon learning of Jackson's injury, Lee famously said he has lost his left arm. His arm was amputated. He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. And he really had. In my opinion, when I read the biographies and the stories of the Civil War, I honestly see Stonewall Jackson as a more effective leader, a more effective general than Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee gets the legend and the notoriety after the fact, which we'll visit in a later episode. But that's the way I see it. Stonewall Jackson, I just think, was a more effective general at the end of all things. To Confederates, Jackson really became more than a general. He became a symbol of courage. He became a symbol of sacrifice and faith and even military genius. His legend really endures long after the war, making him one of the most revered figures in Southern memory. But above all these others, of course, you do have Robert E. Lee. All right. Robert E. Lee was born into one of Virginia's most distinguished families. He was educated at the United States Military Academy, possessed an impeccable credentials, remarkable military skill, and a reputation for this personal dignity. All right. To me, Robert E. Lee is the embodiment of this Southern aristocracy. Lee's father was Light Horse Harry Lee, a key officer for George Washington during the American Revolution. After the Revolution, Light Horse Harry Lee was far from honorable, all right? He ended his life on the run from creditors. He abandoned his family. But his son, Robert E. Lee, seemed intent on redeeming the family reputation. He ended up marrying a granddaughter of Martha Washington, George Washington's wife, who had children from a prior marriage. Even before the war, Robert E. Lee was widely regarded as one of the finest officers in the U.S. Army. That was from the mouth of the hero of the Mexican-American War, Winfield Scott. As soon as the states began seceding from the Union, Winfield Scott, head of the military, but well past his own prime, he immediately tried to recruit Robert E. Lee to lead Union forces. Lee's response, it's pretty famous, really. He explained he personally opposed secession, and he reportedly hoped for a peaceful resolution to the crisis. But when Virginia left the Union, he concluded that his first loyalty belonged to his home state. So he declined an offer to command Union forces because they had offered him, you can be commander of the U.S. forces here. He declined that, resigned his commission, and he joined the Confederacy. So this decision by Robert E. Lee, it's always framed really as an honorable within that context of the honor culture of the South. He was loyal to his country. He believed secession and slavery were wrong, but his first loyalty was to his homeland. Now, it sounds right until you really think about it for a moment. Nearly every definition of real courage that I can think of that's been proposed by different philosophers, different religious leaders and influencers through the years at different points in history, it always involves some version of the idea of doing what you believe is right even when all around you are saying to do something else. In other words, doing what's right even when it's not popular. That's the definition of courage. When you think about it, that's the opposite of what Robert E. Lee did. He believed slavery and secession were wrong, but he went the way of those closest to him, his friends and family back home. In my mind, once you see it from that perspective, once you see this backward logic of courage and honor, it kind of reframes the whole legend of Robert E. Lee. That's the way I see it. But Lee's choice reflected a broader pattern among many of the Southern officers. The United States Army before the Civil War was really small, and its officer corps was highly professional at the time. So a significant number of its most experienced leaders actually came from Southern states. And when those states seceded, many officers faced a painful conflict between national service or local allegiance. And men such as Robert E. Lee, such as Johnston and others, they chose their states over the Union. So their departures from the U.S. Army deprived the North of some of its most seasoned military talent and gave the Confederacy an experienced leadership cadre at the very moment it was forming an army from scratch. Now, contrast that. The Union entered the war with a shortage of proven battlefield commanders. Many of its earliest generals owed their positions not to military accomplishments, but to political influence. These political generals, as they came to be called, were often appointed to satisfy regional, ethnic, or partisan constituencies. Lincoln specifically appointed some of them to keep some of the border states, like Kentucky, from going the way of secession. It was a horrible move by Lincoln and cost the Union Army immensely. Many of these generals lacked the basic training and experience necessary to command large armies in modern warfare. Early Union campaigns were frequently marked by caution, confusion, and just flat-out missed opportunities. Early on in the war, the Southern press, they often mocked Robert E. Lee for being too cautious. They called him Granny Lee. It wasn't until he'd been put in full charge of the Confederate Army that the South realized what a significant leader they had on their hands. But even at that, in his autobiography, Ulysses S. Grant, he says that he felt the scales and perspectives regarding Robert E. Lee were a bit tilted. Grant notes that, and this is later in life, he noted that it was against these weak Union political generals that Robert E. Lee made his reputation. When pitted against more formidable, more seasoned foes like Grant himself later on in the war, Robert E. Lee wasn't near the tactician that he was often renowned for being. Whatever the case, the Confederacy enjoyed a significant leadership advantage during the opening years of the war. Confederate generals often demonstrated greater operational skill and battlefield confidence than the Union counterparts had. Combined with defensive strategy and strong motivation among Southern soldiers, this advantage contributed to a series of impressive Confederate victories despite the South's smaller population and industrial base. So the very aristocratic culture that produced many of these celebrated leaders, there was also some limitations that came along with it. The Confederacy depended heavily on the talents of a relatively small elite and ultimately lacked the manpower, the industry, the transportation networks, and the financial resources necessary to sustain a prolonged war. Nevertheless, during the conflict's early years, the image of the gallant Southern general, embodied most completely by Robert E. Lee, it became one of the Confederacy's greatest strengths and most enduring legacies. And we're going to come back to that later on in this part of the series. But then on the other side, leading the Union Army, there's George B. McClellan. Now, McClellan represents another of those what-ifs of history. At multiple junctures in his career, he represents that. Few Union generals inspired as much hope, as much frustration, as much controversy as George B. McClellan did. He was a graduate of the United States Military Academy, a veteran of the Mexican-American War. McClellan, he was widely regarded as one of the brightest young officers in the United States Army. Before the Civil War, he worked as an engineer, as a railroad executive, as a military observer in Europe, and he was building a reputation as an intelligent and capable organizer. Well, when war erupts in 1861, a series of early successes in Western Virginia quickly elevated him to national prominence. Following the Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run, President Lincoln, he turns to McClellan to rebuild the shattered army defending Washington. And in this role, McClellan excelled, okay? He transformed a collection of inexperienced volunteers into a formidable Army of the Potomac, as they came to be known. He established training programs, he improved discipline, he organized supply systems, strengthened defenses around the capital, and created an army capable of sustained operations. Many of the soldiers, and the average soldiers within the units, they adored him. They affectionately called him Little Mac, was what they nicknamed him. But McClellan's strength as an organizer stood in stark contrast to his weakness as a battlefield commander. He possessed immense confidence in his own abilities and often displayed an exaggerated view of both his talents and the size of enemy forces. His letters to his wife during the war, they're just shocking at the levels of egotism that you'll find in these things. He would describe how it's fallen to him to save the nation. He referred to President Lincoln, the commander-in-chief, as an ape and a gorilla, and he alone was competent enough to hold the nation together. Convinced that Confederate armies vastly outnumbered his own, he repeatedly hesitated when opportunities for decisive action presented themselves right before him. And his tendency to overestimate the enemy and demand that there were more troops that needed to be had within his army so that he could face off with the enemy, this led to chronic delays and many, many missed chances for the Union Army to have victory over the South, over the Confederacy. And the basis for these beliefs were usually suspect, and they were almost always wrong, right? He was almost always wrong on this count. His relationship with Lincoln deteriorated as the war progressed. McClellan frequently viewed the President Lincoln, as an amateur, interfering in military affairs, while Lincoln, he himself grew increasingly exasperated by his general's reluctance to fight. On one occasion, as Lincoln visited McClellan's home seeking a conference in the middle of the war, the general came home and then went to bed without even meeting with the president. Their conflict reflected a deeper divide. Abraham Lincoln believed the Union Army existed to defeat the Confederacy, while McClellan seemed perpetually focused on preparing for the perfect campaign that never arrived. Amid the Civil War, there were always rumors of conspiracies and plots. But at one point, one of these rumors, described by the historian Alan C. Guelzo in his biography of Robert E. Lee, the conspiracy or the rumor was that McClellan actually planned to meet with Robert E. Lee on the battlefield, and the two of them would just march into Washington, D.C. under a flag of peace and end the whole war, honoring the Confederacy, perpetuating slavery, and ending the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. McClellan, the leader of the Union Army, seemed to believe that the cause of the war wasn't slavery, it wasn't secession, it was Abraham Lincoln. Now, there's not enough evidence to support this rumored conspiracy as true, but there was enough of an impression for Lincoln to think it might be. And he actually went to visit McClellan just to make sure that this rumor wasn't actually true. For the first few years of the war, McClellan, for all his faults, was all Lincoln believed he had to work with. He even fired McClellan once, only to restore him after a terrible loss on the battlefield. But that would eventually shift. And that shift would only happen once the full costs of the war and human lives began to be realized. People on both sides realized this isn't going to be an easy fight. This is going to be a bloody affair. In our next episode, we're going to look at some of the Union generals, and we'll also look at some of the key battles of the Civil War that literally shook the nation to its core. The world had not seen battles like this before, because the world had not seen a war like this before. That's coming in our next episode in this series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. I'm J.E.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers understand the world they live in with intelligent and faith-based perspectives on current events and the history behind those current events. We'll be back real soon.